to another episode of Search It Up with Sienna, the web series where I use IMDb to discover and talk about all different types of movies and TV shows, and how the people in front of and behind the camera not only make it all possible, but are somehow all interconnected. I talk directly with the talent about their backstories and experiences on and off set, and what they're up to today. On my last episode, I spoke with writer and producer Madeline George and actor Adina Verson about Only Murders in the Building. Kumail Nanjiani is on season 4 of Only Murders in the Building, and he played the role of Nadim in Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. So on this episode, I'm going to be talking about Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. And I am so honored to have my guest today, the director of Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, Gil Kenan, who takes us inside the production and his experience directing the movie. Gil also shares his experiences as a writer on Ghostbusters Afterlife with Jason Reitman and on their upcoming movie Saturday Night. Gil Kenan was also the writer and director of A Boy Called Christmas and the director of the 2015 Poltergeist movie, City of Embers and Monster House. And now, without further ado, here's my interview with Gil Kenan. So I heard you were a huge movie buff as a kid. When did you realize you wanted to work in the film industry, and was there a specific movie that inspired you?
Yeah, I definitely loved movies for a long time before I realized that people actually made them. I think at the beginning, I just was so excited to watch movies, and I guess I thought they were sort of just appearing by spontaneous combustion and that they were just these magical stories that I had access to. But I remember very specifically going to see a film. I was still pretty young. I must have been like 6 years old, maybe
Mhm.
5 or 6. I saw a movie called Time Bandits. Um, and maybe I was a little older, maybe 7. I have to fact check it one of these days. I remember sitting in the movie theater as the movie ended and the credits started rolling. And it was the first time that I was aware that people worked on that film. It was mostly because I just felt like there was such a specific point of view to that story that there must have been a creative force that was choosing what the tone was, what I was looking at, what the environments looked like.
Yeah.
So it kind of came crashing in, this realization that people worked on this stuff. It was then years before I thought about it again. And that was when I started getting into horror movies as a sort of young kid. I mean, like Nightmare on Elm Street was a pretty big movie for me as a kid. And I got really into special effects makeup after that. I entered some competition for kids who loved grisly, gnarly, bloody makeup effects. And I got second place, and I remember meeting some folks who worked in movies doing that stuff. And that was another sort of big moment for me where I was like, oh, wow, okay, this is a job. This is something people can do. If I play my cards right, maybe one day I can be one of those people.
That's so cool. Yeah, definitely. And now there you are.
Now I'm doing it. Now I'm doing it.
And I also know that you wrote a short film at UCLA called The Lark. What inspired that for you to make that film?
A few things. One was when I was a kid, this is such a random inspiration. No one's actually asked me about this, but when I was 12, I got an electric bass guitar I was really excited about. And then a few days later, our house was burglarized and it was really
Oh,
traumatic. Like they stole a
oh
lot
my
of stuff,
God.
including my bass. So I had that weird feeling of this place that you call home being challenged or somehow changed by other people going into it and taking stuff from you. And that felt like an interesting way to meet characters. I remember that was sort of the beginning. I knew that I wanted to meet a couple living in a house
Mhm.
just after their house had been burglarized and figure out what it is that they're missing, what's wrong in their lives, and what can change through the course of this story. It was also inspired by some art I had seen. There was a surrealist artist named Max Ernst who was making in the first half of the 20th century was making really kind of interesting, strange, slightly creepy art where he was taking animal engravings and adding them to human engravings and combining them together to create something really strange. So the combination of those two things was my inspiration.
That's really interesting. How did you get involved with Ghostbusters and working with Jason Reitman?
So Jason Reitman and I have been friends for a long time. We became friends when we both were just getting started as film directors. We were friends for a long time before we started writing together. That sort of just came out of us being interested in the same movies and in telling movies in similar ways. We used to have long conversations about films, and eventually, because this is what we do, we started to write together. We wrote a few scripts, and the movies didn't get made, but the process of writing together was really fun and felt like a natural extension of our friendship. One day, we had talked about Ghostbusters before. Obviously, Ghostbusters was a huge movie in both
Yeah.
of our lives, but in different ways.
Mhm.
And then one day, Jason sort of suggested that he might be ready for us to start thinking about a Ghostbusters story. And that was a really fun kind of, I mean, as you can imagine, it was a sort of blue sky conversation where we could just talk about anything. And so he had a couple of images in mind, and the rest we just wove up together. And it was a really, it was a really fun experience. It was so cool to come up with Phoebe and Trevor and Callie and Gary Gruberson and this whole world of Somerville.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is amazing about the whole Ghostbusters franchise is how the movie brings this horror aspect, but at the same time keeps it more on the family friendly side. And Ghostbusters Afterlife and Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, I feel like carry this on very well, but with a little more horror. But do you think that could be the case because of the technology and CGI we have access to nowadays?
I think that it's an interesting question. I would say that the technology maybe doesn't have as much to do with
Wow.
it. I would say that it comes down to writing and tone. Because the truth is, when you make movies, or at
Yeah.
least when you write movies, you
Mhm.
can imagine anything on the page. And maybe that's where the technology comes to play, is you know that anything you can write, you can put on the screen.
Yeah.
I would say that the stuff that the balance between heart and scares, you could probably achieve that same balance
Mhm.
with like one light and a bed sheet that can pose a ghost. It really all comes down to sort of what the scope of the story is and how you execute it.
Were there any scenes that were particularly challenging to film for Ghostbusters? Because I know in an interview I watched, you were saying how they have like four puppeteers on set, like trying to hold a Slimer together.
Every scene was difficult on Ghostbusters. It was a big movie and
Mhm.
it was a lot of moving pieces. It was
Yeah.
really fun because you get to play with some of the coolest things in the world, like the firehouse, like the one, like Slimer, like Finn Wolfhard. So there were a lot of really amazing elements, but so much planning had to go into every scene. So many things had to work together at the same time in order for the scene to come out right.
Yeah.
So it was a really high level of difficulty for me, but it was also really fun to shoot.
Do you have more nerves about directing a movie like Ghostbusters that is so iconic already, based or like an original idea?
It's definitely scarier to direct something that people already know the world of because
Mhm.
people are going to come into it with a lot of their own expectations. Everyone has opinions about what they think the movie should be and how it should be told. Obviously, you also benefit from the fact that people are coming into something with a lot of love already for the characters and the world that they've seen before. And so your goal is to try to make them feel that the characters that they love are being well taken care of in the story that they're watching. So it is really it's I would say it's like a higher degree of difficulty, but it also comes with a lot of benefits.
As a director, do you have a vision as to how the movie will turn out when you first start? And did it, like for Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, for example, did it turn out how you thought it would?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that that's actually the most important part of the director's job is having an image in your head for what the film should be right at the very beginning. Because you have to, I mean, in Ghostbusters, I had a crew of maybe 700 people, a lot of people. And
Yeah.
you have to be able to communicate with all of those people so they know what the movie is that they're working together to make is going to be. And so you do need to have a really clear idea at the very beginning of what it should feel like, what it should look like, how it should move, how it should sound. All
Yeah.
of those things are actually really important right from the start of the process.
I think it translated well for Ghostbusters.
Thank you so much.
What is it like directing the original cast? Like, is there something like cool about seeing the original cast kind of interact with the newer cast members of Ghostbusters?
Well, it is really special to there's two things about it that are cool. Well, I guess there's a million things, but two that I'll bring up. One of them is that as a fan, I mean, I grew up loving Ghostbusters. I saw the first film when I was 7.
Mhm.
Again, it was like a pretty big movie for me as a
Yeah.
as a kid. And so to be able to A, tell a story with those characters and B, like tell them where to stand, how how to perform, what the tone of the scene is, what the what Garaka is going to look like and how they're facing off against it. All of that stuff was really cool and felt like, going back to your earlier question about a moment early in life where I thought about making movies.
Mhm.
Like if you had told me as a kid that I was going to get to stand in front of Dan Aykroyd and Bill Murray and Ernie Hudson and Annie Potts and tell them, what they were going to be doing in a scene that I had written, it would have been a wild thing for me to hear. And so it was very, very cool. It is kind of special to see them interacting with the new cast
Mhm.
because the new cast and those new characters, Phoebe and her family, those are characters that never existed before in the popular consciousness before Jason and I wrote them. And so there's something really special about seeing the original characters interacting with them. It feels like a sort of handshake across time.
I love how both in Ghostbusters Afterlife and Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, there are nods to the original movies. But the plots also have their own like spin and keep the story interesting. So how do you keep those ideas fresh? Wait, like keeping a good balance of not exact copying like the original word for word.
That's a really important balance that you have to strike. I mean, you sort of need to be aware of what it is that makes an audience love Ghostbusters. A lot of that is tone, actually. Like you asked earlier, that balance between comedy and horror is
Mhm.
a really important thing that audiences want to come back for
Yeah,
when they're watching a Ghostbusters film. But then there are other elements you have to sort of be really protective of, especially if you're going to use them, like characters like Slimer,
yeah.
which is an iconic sort of fan favorite for for 40 years in June when audiences first
I
met
know
them.
it's crazy.
Isn't
Yeah.
that wild? So you do have to be very protective over these things, but there's no joy in protecting them if you don't also play with them a little bit
Yeah,
and
definitely like
bring
with the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, I feel like that.
exactly. You
Yeah.
got to bring them out and you've got to find something new to do. And remember the same spirit of excitement that you had as a fan watching it the first time. That's
Yeah.
always sort of the answer.
Do you plan on making any more Ghostbusters movies, or do you hope that there will be more?
I mean, I definitely hope there will be more, mostly because I love these characters and I like watching Ghostbusters movies,
Uh-huh.
let alone making them. Will there be more? Jason and I are definitely looking after the entirety of Ghostbusters. So we're involved in the comic books, we're involved in animation, which we're hoping to do. We're involved in all of the sort of toys and video
Yeah.
games, all of that stuff. And yeah, movies too. So I'm really hoping that we'll get to tell more of these stories with these characters. But right now we're focused on the Saturday Night Live
Yeah.
movie. We finish shooting tomorrow, and that's going to keep us busy for at least the next few months while that's edited together.
Do you like to watch the movies that you make? Like I know some people like don't really watch the movies that they make, but is that something you usually enjoy?
Yeah, I mean, I love seeing them with an audience because
Mhm.
you work for so long making a film in a room, in a dark room where it's just you and an editor. A couple of other people sort of join that process, a composer, sound designer, mixers,
Yeah.
etc. But um, at you get a very interesting moment of time when you're releasing a film where you sort of tour around the world with it to introduce it to audiences. And really for me, that's what it's all about. I love those screenings where I get to see it in in movie theaters, with French audiences or Italian audiences. With Afterlife, it was went down to Mexico, and and then of course the premiere audiences in New York, and all that stuff becomes really almost like a graduation for for the movie and for yourself. It's the moment where it stops being this thing that you're working on and starts becoming a story that the world gets to have a relationship with. And so usually after that, I'm kind of done. I probably don't watch my movies ever again. Every once in a while, I'll dust something off. I think it's been long enough with Monster House where I can watch that and
Yeah.
enjoy it. But it takes me a while because it's such an intense relationship that you have with a
Yeah.
movie that you sort of need to create some space.
I've been reading about your new movie, SNL 1975, and I'm very excited about this because I myself have been on SNL a couple of times, and I always enjoy watching the clips of with my parents of SNL sketches in its early days. I also heard in another interview that when making this, you interviewed some of the cast members. What can you tell us about this movie and maybe how your process varies from working on a movie like Ghostbusters to working on a movie where it's kind of more of a documentary style?
I would say that first of all, it's been an incredible experience. We finish shooting tomorrow,
Mhm.
and then it'll be the end of the second phase of that film. The first phase was writing, and that phase was closer to a documentary process, the writing phase, because we were interviewing real
Yeah.
life people who experienced this first night or the first season of the show almost 50 years ago, which is really wild. It was through that process that Jason and I started to do the writing. The filming of it was a very different experience. Jason's been doing an incredible job directing this thing. It's just so I can't wait for you to see it. It's so fun,
Yeah.
so alive, incredible cast. That part is definitely not like a documentary.
Huh.
That feels like real dynamic filmmaking with
Mhm.
so many moving parts. One of the greatest sets I've ever been on here in the Atlanta area. I think that as the movie comes out, it'll be great to talk again once you've seen it. So
Yeah, definitely, I'd
I,
love to.
I can give you some of the inside scoop right now. I have to be a little protective over the movie because A, it's still being made, and
Yeah,
B, Jason's directing it, and I want to save some of the joy of talking about it for him. It's the coolest. I'm really excited. And
I'm
if
so
you
excited.
if you love Saturday Night Live, then I think you're gonna have a really good time in that movie.
What do you focus on when directing and writing? Like, what are the main differences between, your writing process and your directing process, and is there anything that's very similar with those 2?
Interestingly, I don't separate them that much in my head. I mean, I think of them both as going after the same goal, which is storytelling. It's actually the way that I got started with all of this was just wanting to tell stories when I was a kid. I started getting really excited about writing original stories, and I would put them together in these books. I would go and print them up and kind of hand watercolor them, do drawings in the books and bind them, make copies, and then share them with friends. Or if I couldn't afford to make duplicates, I would just make one and then go around and make people read it while I watch them. So I guess they were my first test audiences. That is actually the sort of same instincts that I have as a writer and as a director. It's like it's all a means to an end. It's also similar to when I was a student and I was animating. It's never about the drawing you're making or the clay character that you're sculpting or the actors that you're working with on set or even the scene that you're writing on a page. It's all about the sort of feeling that an audience is going to have when they're experiencing that story, meeting those characters. That's really all I'm trying to think about. Obviously, there are a million other things on my mind, like what does the set look like? What is the lighting like? How is the camera moving? The sort of only way that I know how to stay sane with all of that stuff and to keep it organized is by thinking about the experience of the story when it's all done.
So my final sort of question, sort of more of like a fun small activity thing.
Uh-huh.
So I started doing this with a few of my guests on my show, and I'm building a story and basically you just say, I'm gonna tell you like what the story is so far, and you add 1 or 2 lines to it, like about what would
Perfect.
happen next.
Got it.
So yeah, this is the story. So once upon a time, there was a young girl who was very quiet in her own way. And that little girl had a mother who was her biggest support, and she encouraged her to go into the world and do amazing things. But then one day, the girl returned home to find that her mother had disappeared. Now she was alone in the world. Then she finds a clue about where her mother might be, and she goes on a journey to see if she can find her mother. She gets a phone call in the middle of the night, and it's her mother saying, "Please don't try to find me. I left because I had to leave, and I'm sorry." But the little girl didn't listen to her mother. She went into the garage, got her mother's electric scooter, fired it up, and drove off into the night.
Oh, great. Oh, I get a good part. I feel like I get act two. Also the hardest part of telling a story. Were you calling her the little girl?
Yeah, the little girl. She doesn't really have a name yet.
All right. We'll keep her mysterious. It means the audience gets to think about who she is. All right, let me think
Yeah.
about this for a second. The little girl rode as far as the electric scooter could take her, past the neighborhood that she knew where she grew up, and into the city, a place she had only ever gone with her mother. And now she found herself there alone at night, and her scooter ran out of power.
Oh, so that's a cliffhanger right there. Well, that is a great part to the story. I'm very excited to see where that goes after the part that you just added, because it could definitely go in many directions, I feel like.
That's so fun. I've really enjoyed our chat, and I
Yes,
lo-
me
love
too.
I love that idea of the story. That's really good. Really enjoyed our chat, Sienna. Thanks so
Yes,
much
me
for having
too.
me on your show.
Thank you so much for coming and letting me talk to you. And I'll definitely reach out to you after the SNL movie because I'd love to talk to you about that too.
For sure. Thanks, and have a wonderful weekend.
Yes, you too. Have a good shooting day tomorrow.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Gil, for your time and your insight. I can't wait to see Saturday night. And now, before we search it up, here's a quick fun fact. Did you know that Ghostbusters Frozen Empire was released 40 years after the original Ghostbusters movie? And now it's time to search it up. Let's see. Oh, Dan Aykroyd was in Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, and he was a cast member on Saturday Night Live. So next time, we'll be talking about Saturday Night Live. See you then!